Walter Boyd was 61 years old, and he was watching the greatest invention of his life being sold by another man. That August, at the Lafayette Fair, he stood in front of Holloway's new red cultivator, looking at the small, spring-loaded piece on the back shank of the machine, the piece he had made years earlier, in his own tool shed, with his own hands. Lawrence Pyle, the sales manager working the stand, turned an old farmer's close study of the machine into a performance for the crowd. He smiled and raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Our engineers developed this mechanism, sir. No offense, but a design like this isn't built in a barn. That kind of work takes engineering." A few farmers turned and looked. One chuckled quietly. Walter said nothing. He laid his hand on the piece, ran a calloused finger over the spring assembly, and said quietly, "You might want to check who patented that." Then he turned and walked off through the crowd. Pyle kept smiling behind Boyd's back, sharing the moment with the man beside him. For now, he was the winner. But 8 months later, in Rockford, Illinois, the lawyers of that same company would slide a piece of paper across a table to Walter Boyd. And not one of them would be smiling, because Walter Boyd had something Holloway Manufacturing's entire engineering team had never thought to look for. A patent. A patent with his own name on it, stamped with a federal seal, and dated a full 3 years before that red cultivator ever existed. When Pyle said equipment isn't designed in a barn, he was actually right. Walter hadn't designed it in a barn. He had designed it in the tool shed his father left him. And that was a small difference that would change everything. Walter Boyd was 61 years old in 1968. He lived in Clinton County, Indiana, a few miles west of Frankfort, on a flat, dark-soiled corn and soybean farm that ran along State Route 28, land his great-grandfather had broken, his grandfather had planted, and his father had left to him. He wasn't a rich man. 240 acres, an old Ferguson tractor, a worn-out barn, and a list of work that never ended. Boyd hadn't gone to school past the 8th grade. Everything he knew he had learned at his father's side, over iron and machinery. In 3 counties, 2 things were known about him. He never threw away anything that broke, he fixed it. And when no one else could solve a machine's problem, he was the man you called. But there, at the fairground, in front of a sales manager in a sharp suit, he was just an old farmer. He had no diploma, no title, no company behind him, and not a soul in the world took seriously what a single piece of paper in his hand might be worth against a giant corporation. Walter's father, Samuel Boyd, loved fixing things more than farming. In that tool shed at the edge of the farm there was an anvil, a vise, a welding set, and dozens of hand tools, all of them cared for, year after year. Samuel had a saying Walter had heard many times as a boy: "You'll make what you can't buy." Samuel didn't teach it through lectures. He taught it by working with the boy at his side. Walter watched parts come apart, learned to tell what was wrong with an engine from its sound, the way a doctor hears something in a chest. He laid his first weld at 12. At 15, he repaired a broken combine mechanism on his own. When his father died in 1951, he left Walter 2 things: that tool shed and the belief that you make what you can't buy. For the next 17 years, Walter made even the things other people had thrown away run again in that shed. But there was one problem that had troubled him for years, and the day he solved it, even he didn't understand how valuable it was. The problem started in the same place every spring. The north end of Walter's field was full of stones the glaciers had left behind thousands of years ago, hard grey rocks hidden under the soil, waiting for the plough and the cultivator. Every spring, just as the planting window narrowed, one of the cultivator's shanks would strike a rock like that, and the steel would snap with a crack, or the shear bolt would break. A single broken shank cost a few dollars, but that wasn't the real cost. The real cost was stopping the tractor in the middle of the field to change the part and losing half a day. And half a day sometimes meant a whole season. There were spring shanks on the market back then. They kicked up when they hit something. But Walter had tried them and didn't like them, because when the shank kicked up, the point tipped too, it didn't enter the soil properly, and the depth was thrown off. What Walter wanted was cleverer. A shank that gave way only when it hit a real obstruction, a rock, but held rock steady in normal hard soil, and the moment it cleared the obstruction, returned to its exact position on its own, without ever stopping the tractor. Back then, doing that on a light cultivator shank was considered all but impossible. Walter worked on this problem for 3 winters. After supper, he would go out to the shed, light the stove, and spend hours at the anvil bending springs, pins, and arms. The heart of the solution was a balance point no one could set right. The position of the pivot pin, the tension of the spring, and the angle of the arm had to come together in a geometry where the shank wouldn't yield to small resistances but would trip back instantly under a hard blow, then settle back into place with a clack as the spring pushed it home. Dozens of attempts failed. One night the spring was too stiff and the shank wouldn't give at all. Another night it was too soft and the shank jumped at the smallest lump. Then, on a cold February night in 1962, he moved the pivot pin forward by half a finger's width, set the spring at a certain angle, and suddenly everything fell into place. The next morning, he mounted the piece on his own cultivator, drove out to the north field, and ran it deliberately over the biggest stones. The shank tripped back, cleared the rock, and returned to its exact position on its own, without the tractor slowing at all. Walter stopped the tractor, climbed down, and looked at the piece for a long time. When Ruth asked him that evening what had happened, all he said was, "I think I solved the thing that's been after me for years." He had no idea how right he was. Walter had never thought about patenting that piece. He had made it only for his own field. But that spring, a neighbor saw it and wanted one for his own cultivator. Then another neighbor asked too. A dealer in Frankfurt heard about it as well and told Walter, "You need to protect this, or someone will take it and sell it under his own name." Walter brought it up with Ruth. She thought about it for a long while, then said, sitting at the kitchen table, "Your father always said to make what you can't buy. And you did. Now protect it." So Walter, for the first time in his life, went to Indianapolis and found a patent attorney, a man named Albert Quinn, plain, calm, and without airs. Quinn looked at the piece, looked at the drawings, and said, "This really is new. No one has ever done it exactly this way." Preparing the drawings, filing the application, and waiting took months. The patent cost Walter $460. For a farmer, that was a small fortune, and for a long time it felt like a completely foolish expense. The patent came in 1965, number 3,198,247, good for 17 years, until 1982. Walter looked at it once, then put it away in the steel box in the kitchen and all but forgot it. Because what he didn't know at the time was that in Rockford, Illinois, the engineers of a huge company had started working on the very same problem. At the end of 1967, Holloway Manufacturing announced a new line of cultivators. In their advertisements, they boasted about one thing: a revolutionary shank that wouldn't break when it struck the stones in a field, and that returned to position on its own. Walter first read about it in a farm magazine, and then, that August, he saw the piece with his own eyes at the big fair near Lafayette. He walked up to Holloway's stand, bent down, looked under the shank, and for a moment he couldn't breathe at what he saw. The pivot pin was exactly where he had placed it. The angle of the spring was exactly the angle he had found. This was not a similar piece. This was his piece. And it was right then that Lawrence Pyle had come over, smiled in front of the crowd, and said that no man designs farm equipment in a barn. That evening, Walter drove home, pulled the truck into the garage, went inside, and opened the steel box in the kitchen. He hadn't looked at it in years, but he knew exactly where it was. He took out the paper, now starting to yellow, set it on the table and said to Ruth only this: "Tomorrow, I'm going to Indianapolis. Holloway Manufacturing, with an army of hundreds of lawyers and engineers, was one of the largest farm equipment makers in the country. And in the hands of a 61-year-old farmer with an 8th-grade education, there was one thing that could stop them. As long as someone bothered to read that paper." Albert Quinn spread the yellowed paper Walter had brought across his desk and read it for a long time. "Do you understand what you have here?" he finally asked. Walter shrugged. "A patent." Quinn shook his head. "No. What you have is an invention no one else had made before a certain date. And that date is long before Holloway's machine." Quinn patiently explained to him how a patent worked. Walter's patent documented 3 things: the dated technical drawings he had made at his kitchen table in 1962, the prototype that had been running in his own field since that winter, and the official number stamped with a federal seal in 1965, 3,198,247. A patent didn't just describe an invention, it fixed it to a particular moment. Under American patent law in those days, the only thing that mattered was who invented it first. And Walter had been running his prototype years before Holloway's engineers ever started turning the problem over in their heads. Quinn folded the paper. "They never looked for this," he said. "It never even crossed their minds that a man like you might be holding a piece of paper like this." Quinn sent a formal letter to Holloway Manufacturing. The letter had the patent number, a claim of infringement, and a clear demand: a license or court. 3 weeks later, a reply came from the company's legal department. The letter was polite, cold, and confident. They wrote that the company's engineers had developed the mechanism independently, that the patent was vague, that too many years had passed, and that a claim like this would never hold up in court. What was said between the lines was far clearer. "You're a small farmer. We're a corporation, and you don't have the money to fight us." Walter read the letter at the kitchen table while Ruth sat across from him. "Maybe they're right," Walter said quietly. "Maybe this fight isn't for me." Ruth said nothing for a long time. Then she stood up, brought the steel box, took out the patent, and set it on the table right in front of Walter. "Your father wouldn't have let you go to all that trouble for nothing," she said. "Don't you let it be for nothing either." The next morning, Walter called Quinn and said only one thing: "We're going ahead." What Holloway's lawyers were counting on was a mistaken belief, and that mistake was about to cost the company dearly, because in patent law there was no defense of "we came up with it ourselves." The only question was this: did the piece the company sold do what Walter's patent described? It did, exactly. The position of the pivot pin was the same, the angle of the spring was the same. That balance point that let the shank trip back and reset into place on its own was the same. 2 engineers might have solved the same problem the same way, but under the law, the second one to solve it was infringing the first one's patent, whatever his intent. What's more, the part Walter had solved was the part considered hardest of all up to then. Automatic reset could be managed to a degree on heavy plows, but on a light cultivator shank, no one had fully built a mechanism that held firm in normal soil, yet tripped back instantly on a big rock and then settled back into place on its own. That was what made the patent so solid. To invalidate it, they would have had to have built it before Walter did. So how had a huge company like Holloway overlooked it? Not because they were fools. They had run a search at the patent office, but that document, filed under a plain farmer's name, they had either never seen or never taken seriously. A corporation so trusted its own engineering power that it never once factored in the possibility that a man had solved the same problem years earlier. When Holloway's chief legal counsel took up the file again, he didn't like what he saw. Walter's patent was valid, in force, and clearly came before the company's product. Worse, if it were proven in court that the company had copied the part, the law allowed for 3 times the damages. And there was a dangerous question here. Had Holloway's engineers truly come up with the mechanism from scratch, or had they seen a farmer's part somewhere? That was a question the company's lawyers did not want to hear the answer to. A lawsuit could drag on for years, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and, if lost, damage the company's reputation. The chief counsel ran the numbers and came to a simple conclusion. Fighting would cost far more than settling. Holloway invited Walter Boyd and his attorney to a meeting at the headquarters in Rockford. That morning, Walter put on his best suit. Ruth poured him coffee, and the two of them sat without saying much. "What do you think will happen?" Ruth asked. Walter looked out the window at the field. "I don't know," he said, "but that paper has my name on it." The conference room in Rockford was cold, the air conditioning humming quietly, and at one end of the long, polished table sat 3 of Holloway's lawyers, and to one side, that young engineer. The man who had laughed with Pyle at the fair, Martin Rees. Albert Quinn didn't say much. From his bag, he first took out the dated technical drawings from 1962 and laid them on the table. Then he laid down the patent. Then he took out that old, scratched prototype piece Walter had been running in his own field for years and set it right beside the part removed from Holloway's new cultivator. The 2 metal pieces sat side by side on the polished wood. One was stained with oil and soil, the other gleaming with factory paint. But their shapes were the same. Quinn said only one thing. "Mr. Rees, if you can see any difference between these 2 pieces, please say so." Martin Rees looked at both pieces for a long time. He picked one up, turned it over, held it to the light, and set it back down next to the other. One of the company's lawyers cleared his throat. Rees raised his head and finally told the truth. "It's the same piece. The pivot, the spring angle, the reset geometry, all of it is the same. There's no other way for me to put it." The room went quiet. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed very loud. Holloway's chief attorney set his pen down on the table, and in that room, no one claimed again that the pieces were different. The settlement took shape that afternoon. Holloway never openly admitted it had infringed the patent, but it licensed the patent, which amounted to the same thing. The company would make a back payment for every cultivator it had sold, carrying the mechanism up to that point. The first check was $58,400, and from then on until the patent expired in 1982, they would pay Walter $22 for every machine sold, carrying that shank. When Walter heard the figures, his face didn't change. He just nodded once. The way a man nods at something he's known all along. On the way home, Quinn asked him, "How much did it cost you to get the patent?" Walter thought for a moment. $460, he said. For years it felt like a foolish expense. Quinn smiled but said nothing, because they both knew those $460 were the smartest investment a farmer ever made in his life. By the time the patent expired in 1982, those checks had added up to more than $240,000. By the next season, Lawrence Pyle was no longer the sales manager for that territory. The company never accused him openly. It simply, quietly, moved him to another post. But what had happened at the fairground spread through the countryside fast. In 3 counties, farmers told the story to one another over coffee, and with each telling, Walter Boyd's name grew a little larger. Most stories would end here. But there was one more thing. Walter didn't use any of that money to expand his farm, didn't buy a new tractor, didn't change his life. The only new thing he bought was a better welder for the tool shed. Everything else stayed the way it was. When the patent expired in 1982, Walter's little spring-loaded shank was working on tens of thousands of machines across the country. Most farmers never knew who had come up with it. But Walter knew. and that was enough for him. 3 things were left behind. The spring he had bent by hand at the anvil on a cold February night, the dated drawings he had made at the kitchen table under a single lamp, and that federal number no one in Rockford had bothered to read, 3,198,247. His father, Samuel, had always told him, "You'll make what you can't buy." Walter had done just that, and then a huge company learned it couldn't buy him out. Maybe there's been someone like that in your life too. Someone who knew a thing no one else cared about, who quietly carried in his pocket a detail everyone else had overlooked, who was proven right without ever raising his voice. Or maybe that person is you. Tell us in the comments. And if these stories about quiet people, patient hands, and those who were underestimated and finally proven right stir something in you, you can subscribe. There are many more stories to tell.